This is part 3 of the simple patchwork placemats, and you can see that I have each of the placemats pieced and pressed, and I have a couple of pins in the center of each right now. I have batting that you see around the top, and I changed my mind on the backing fabric. I was going to use a fabric that I also planning on making an apron out of, but I decided I didn't want to make the apron today and then have the extra fabric. I wanted to finish these first. So I went back through my fabrics, and I found one that's a little bit odd maybe to some, but it's a fabric that I had bought a while ago. It's actually Space Shuttles, and it's a novelty type fabric. It's a little bit of a heavier cotton than normally would be used for quilting cotton. And so maybe these will be moon rocks, or maybe the front of the placemat will be elegant and the back of the placemat will be a conversation piece. In other words, it was fabric I had that I could use, and since it's on the back, I don't really mind that there are space shuttles there. The shuttle and NASA are actually related to military, which I'm involved with Quilts for Veterans. I don't know if you know, but a lot of the pilots for NASA and astronauts start out in the Navy or the Marines or the Air Force. I'm not sure about the Coast Guard. And then they end up furthering their careers with NASA. So it's a subject that means something to me. I'm not sure if the average person would appreciate it. So, but anyway, it's two pieces. I had one large piece that cut in half exactly fit the back of these, with one exception. I have this is cotton, Warm and Natural brand cotton batting. And when I cut the backing fabric, if I fold up the batting, you'll see that I only have almost a ½ inch on the edge here. And that I'm going to do a fold over binding on this. So when I bind this, I have very little fabric to work with. So what has to happen is I have to make sure that I have it even on both sides, that the top piece leaves the same amount of fabric on each, the top and the bottom. On the sides, it isn't that much of a problem. But as I was saying, the battery had died, I'm sorry. But this is how you put your backing fabric, your batting, and your top piece. Now before I show you the next steps on that, I want to talk a little bit about batting. I recently got another vintage machine, which is actually a Model 20, which is a small machine, marketed in some ways for children, but as a first sewing machine. And in the booklet that came with that, they mention quilting and using flannel as the batting. So I looked around the house to see if I had any flannel, because I think that's a great idea. And for anyone who isn't a quilter and just wants to try this before they buy a lot of supplies, if you have a piece of flannel or an old flannel shirt or a flannel bathrobe, flannel pajamas, anything you can cut up that you could use as a batting. Now, in addition, here are some other fabrics you could use. This is a stretch knit fabric, kind of like a t-shirt fabric. It's cotton, but it's a knit and it's heavy. Now, granted, it's black. The light is having it look a little reddish, but it's black. This one is a sweatshirt fabric that is maroon, and it's on the thinner side of sweatshirt fabric, so you could use that too. Now, this one is another sweatshirt fabric, but this is for a heavy-duty sweatshirt. And you could use it, but it's a little bit on the thick side. you need your batting to be able to compress a little bit and not be an overly thick layer. It's just a layer to trap warmth. Now, so there, around the house you probably have different fabrics or things that you could cut up to use as batting if you don't have batting. And when I was looking around for that and realizing that on this piece here, if I decided to use either the black or the maroon fabric, I would have the black or the maroon showing through on the white areas of the squares. So then I thought, what about this? This is, and I haven't tried this yet, but I'm going to try it in a moment. This is a grocery bag, a plastic heavy-duty grocery bag. And I've cut two pieces up that would fit not as wide as the batting, but perhaps that's what I should have, is have it the same size as the batting. But if I were going to use, say, the black fabric, which is the darkest, if I put that on top of it, all of a sudden you don't see the black. Granted, it would be better to use just plain white without any logos on it or anything. Now, there's something else that adds to the placemats. If you have a nice kitchen table, a nice wooden kitchen table that you take care of and maybe you polish every day and everything, if you put that plastic bag underneath the top layer here, all of a sudden you have a waterproof placemat that if you have children or if you don't have children, if something spills, it'll go on the placemat, and maybe that would get ruined if it were like cranberry juice or something, but you could wash it out. But it won't go through to your table. So I have a painted table I use most of the time, but I know my mother had a beautiful, we had a beautiful oak, I think it was an oak kitchen table that, you know, we didn't move when we were kids because we were so afraid we would spill something on the table. And I was just thinking that, you know, for today, that adding plastic layer, whether you're hiding a batting color or not, is actually kind of a good idea. It also is a way to recycle plastic bags that otherwise end up in the landfill or wrapped around some seagull's neck or wrapped around a whale or some other way that our plastic ends up in the wrong places. So that was an idea that I came across when I was doing this. Now I want to show you a finished mat that is similar but smaller. This is where we're headed in a way. This is hand-pieced, hand-stitched, and hand-quilted. And this is one option for how you quilt these placemats. If I were going to hand quilt a patchwork placemat, I could either do a flower motif. If I had, these are only about 2.5 inches wide, you'd need a very small stencil or an easy-to-trace design of your own or something. And I'll talk about that in a minute in transferring stencils. So you could either do a design on each square, you could go around each square like that, about 1/8 of an inch away from the seams. So that would be treating each square separately. Another idea is to quilt just along the seams, 1/4 inch away from the seam all the way down, and then going in the other direction, 1/4 inch away from the seam all the way across. And you would do this on both sides of each seam. So you would end up with a quilting line here, a quilting line here, a quilting line here, and also this way. Now that is shown on this one, right here, here, here. So you could only do these, and it would still hold your placemat together and still look nice and still be quilted. Depending on the batting you use, if you use commercial batting, some of them require that you are quilting every 4 inches. This brand, Warm and Natural Cotton batting, I believe it's every 10 inches, but I would have to check. With your own flannel or fabric, it's a woven fabric, so it's not going to pull apart in the wash. So when you're using your own fabric as a batting, I would go by, on this project, I would just go no wider than a square. In other words, this is your design element, so you don't want to go too much wider than a square when you're doing the quilting. So either by hand or by machine, you can do any of those quilting things that I just mentioned. You can either hand quilt, or I guess if you were really good at embroidery on a machine, you could do embroidery motifs in the center. Personally, when I do hand quilting, I use a stencil, and I'll show you what you need for those, although I'm not going to be stenciling on these placemats. Here's a blank fabric, and these are stencils that I get from a company called the Stencil Company, and they have hundreds of quilting stencils, all different sizes. These are 3 inches, and these are in fact the ones I used here, both of these designs. And what you need is a product called Pounce, and I have no idea why they called it that. This is a pouncing pad. Pounce is really a chalk powder, and this is one brand. There are different brands. Sometimes they're only in a small knit bag, and you just pat the bag on there. Now this product, Quilt Pounce by Hancy, I think, this says to swipe it, and in this product you lift this top up, put the powder in here, and it says you swipe it where the stencil is, like that. I usually, and this is probably where they came up with the name, I pounce it, but I don't call it pouncing. Now that didn't show up very well. Let me grab another one. This is new. I just bought this, so the actual powder hasn't made it all the way down to the pad yet. This is one of the other ones, and this one is almost empty. It's very thin, and I'll just do one area so the stencil doesn't move. This may not come out either because there's not much in there. It's very light. Let me put the camera down for a moment. Find another one. Maybe if I hold this still. And that's actually more of a rubbing. Let's see if any of that comes out. There we go. And so that's a blue chalk powder. And now if I were quilting that by hand, I then just follow the lines for the quilt pattern. So that's how you use stencils and Pounce for hand quilting. And I am not knowledgeable in machine embroidery, so I wouldn't be able to show you how to do that. I haven't quite decided what I'm going to do with these for my quilting, but while I'm thinking about that, let me just explain how the edge will be finished. When I got to the end of quilting this one, I cut the batting right to the edge of the fabric. So in this case, I would, after it's quilted, I would cut the batting right to the edge of here. You have to be careful not to also cut your backing. So of course I do that with scissors and not a rotary cutter. And then, with the batting gone, what I did on that mat was fold an amount of fabric over, press it, and then fold it again. And when you do that, right before you do that, you trim it to double the width you're going to do that with. So if I'm going to fold it over by 1/4 of an inch twice, I need a 1/2 inch on the edge. So I would then trim the fabric to a 1/2 inch, fold it over twice, and fold it up onto the top fabric. And in this case, I hand stitched it with a slip stitch in place. But with a machine, you would use your machine and do a very straight line right down the center. And that is how you bind your piece. That's called binding the piece. So you have, with your placemats, you have choices on whether to hand or machine quilt. You have choices of your quilting design. And basically, once you are done quilting your piece, you trim the batting away to the edge of the top. You trim the backing to the width that you need to fold it over twice. And let's just pretend this is already trimmed. And pretend it's only 1/4 inch wide. You fold it over like that and then stitch close to this edge. Or hand stitch with a slip stitch to hold it in place. And that is how you will be finishing your placemat. Now there's a couple of things I want to find out today as I'm doing this. And one is I'm going to do a little bit of machine stitching on these pieces, which would be, these are just like a quilt in a sense. I have 2 pieces of muslin and a piece of thicker wool on the back, and that is going to pretend to be 3 layers. And this is a piece of the plastic from the plastic bag, and I have it underneath the black wool, so in this case the black would be the top and the muslin would be the back. And I'm just going to do a little stitching on this to see how the machine handles going through the plastic. Because for myself, that's actually something I might want to do, is start adding a layer of plastic under the top of my placemats. Because obviously you can still throw the placemats in the wash, but if sometimes these mats that I use end up on top of my sewing machines. Not that I put a plate and dinner on top of my sewing machine treadles, but just the idea that if I knew there was a layer of plastic there and that nothing, well, say I put an oil can on one and the oil seeps through. I mean, it's almost another layer of protection in addition to having a mat on top of something. So what I'm going to do now is do a little bit of machine stitching through this with the Brother LX3014 and just see how the machine handles sewing through plastic. Now what I did was trim the plastic to fit the squares a little bit better, and again I'm keeping this lined up with the right hand side of the presser foot. I have just 1 pin in this, and we'll just see how this goes through the plastic. I have the machine set on a stitch setting of 9, and I still have the tension at about 2.5. Now this is shifting a little bit as I sew, so that's something that would maybe be an issue with if you're machine piecing. The top fabric might slide around a little bit on the plastic, so that's something to think about. In fact, it's even pushing the black around. So for a first-time project, you might not want to add the plastic if you want to make sure everything is accurate. Now, I already know I'm off the edge here, so I'm just going to go ahead and stitch. Oh, it looks like my bobbin ran out. So, with the plastic, what we know right away, I only got the one seam on there. It makes it very slippery to sew with. I think it's a great idea. I don't know if additional pinning, if I have smaller pins that are only an inch long. If I had several of those around here, I don't think the shifting would be as much of an issue. Now I have to wind a bobbin and put that in the machine. And I think what I'm going to do on the Patchwork Placemats that I've been working on, I think I'm going to do straight stitching on either side of the seams. So after I wind a bobbin, I will show you how I'm doing that. Okay, I have wound the bobbin, and I'm going to go ahead and finish stitching around this square that has the plastic on it. I put 2 pins in, and I just want to see not only how much this shifts or doesn't shift, I want to see what it's like to actually work with this. So it is still shifting, even though it's pinned twice. I want to keep my pins out of the way. And it's pushing the fabric. Now, part of that could be that I'm using wool on the top, because the wool is woven in a different, well, it ends up with a different effect. It's still woven, but you end up with a different effect with wool because of the way that it's woven. The fibers themselves are more loose than, say, muslin or cotton. So now that we have the 3 stitched together, let me just do a little bit of stitching and see how it comes out. Now, I can't say that the muslin is shifting at all, but there's 2 layers of muslin, then the plastic, then the wool. So if you are actually going, I guess that means the best place to put the plastic would be under the batting, which kind of goes against what my purpose would have been, which would have been to hide the color of the batting. Another option would be to stitch the plastic to the batting before you put it in the actual quilt sandwich, as they call it. But as far as the machine sewing through the plastic, I don't notice any difference whatsoever from regular sewing. So I have a lot of loose threads here, but let me trim those off and show you this. So this is the muslin side that I just stitched on, and the quilting looks good. So 2 layers of muslin, then the plastic, then the wool. This is the wool side, And the quilting looks just as good. So it isn't, other than the fabric that's closest to the plastic shifting, it doesn't cause any problem for the machine. It probably also wouldn't cause any problem for hand quilting. I can't see that I would have a problem going through plastic if I were hand quilting. No, see, a pin goes right through that without a problem, so a needle would. So that's an option, I think, but I think what I would recommend, if you're going to use, say, a flannel fabric, which would be probably a plaid, and you want to hide that pattern from a lighter fabric on the top, I would put a layer of grocery bag plastic there. White would be preferable to clear, obviously, and I would stitch it to your batting fabric before you layer it in the actual quilt. So I may be doing that in the future. In the meantime, what I'm going to do is further pin these pieces. Now, the type of pinning that you do is going to depend on the type of quilting that you're planning. So now that I've decided that I'm going to do the quilting on either side of the seams, I actually want to pin each square in the center. And because the blocks are so small, I might even use shorter pins, regular 1.5" dressmaking pins, instead of 2-inch quilting pins, because then I know I'm not going to run into a pin when I'm doing my stitching. So when you're quilting along the seams, you want to pin every block in the center through all 3 layers, or 4 layers if you've added the plastic. If you are doing, you could also pin it in the middle if you are doing outline quilting. And what you want to do is get the 3 layers held together. If you are then going to add a motif or hand quilting a motif in the center, if you do both types of quilting, so you would do all the seam sides first and then go back and add the motif, or you would do around the square and then add the motif. So with the machine quilting, because I'm going to do on either side of the seams, I need to pin each square in the center so that I am not running into a pin as I'm stitching. Another thing to note is that with all quilting, you want to start your pinning in the center, or as close to the center as you can get, depending on whether you have this laid on the floor. When I have these on the floor, I actually am kneeling all over most of the quilt to start the pinning in the center. And then you continue to smooth everything out as you pin. Obviously, with these placemats, it's not hard to start in the center and then work outward. On a larger piece, I start in the center and then move to a corner. Then I go back to the center to the next block and move to another corner. So that is how I'm going to pin this, and in a moment I'll show you just stitching down the side. I may or may not be able to show you the binding in more detail later on in this video. I'm not sure if I'll be able to finish all of this at once, but I think you understand what I mean. You just fold it over twice and then fold it to the top of the mat and stitch it either by machine with a simple stitch as close to the edge as you can get, or hand stitch it with a slip stitch. So let's see how far we get today, and what I'll do is show you the quilting. Okay, now I have the placemat placed under the needle, and I'm making an assumption here, which I can almost tell is accurate anyway, that the left side of the presser foot is the same width as the right side. So if I keep the left side of the presser foot, and this is the general purpose presser foot on the brother, if I keep this lined up with my seam, I should always be a 1/4 inch away from the seam. And I have the piece pinned, and this is really fast, easy quilting, especially on something the size of a placemat. But it doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to it as you're doing it. So let me show you how I'm going to do this, and then what I'll probably do is go ahead and quilt the 2 placemats and try to get to showing you the binding. I have workmen that might be in the yard at some point today, and they're bringing heavy machinery. And if they do that, all you're going to hear is machinery, and you won't hear what I'm saying. So hopefully I can get this complete and show you the completed placemat at the end of this video. But this is how I'm going to go ahead and quilt. And whether it's a big piece, a big project, or a small project, you're going to have to kind of grab the fabric and make sure that, not to pull it per se, but to make sure it evenly feeds through the machine. Now, ideally, I would be starting in the center, the exact center of the quilt, and working outward. But because of the type of quilting I'm doing, I'm starting at the top. And I think you can see there that even though this is a small piece, it's moving around a little bit on the machine. So I do have to pay attention, and I do have to watch what I'm doing to keep the seam line lined up with the left side, in this case, of the presser foot. When I do this seam over to the left of it, I will be lining the seam up on the right side of the presser foot. And you want to stop right at the edge of the fabric, simply because when you have a fold-over binding, you're going to be covering that edge right there. So you don't need to go any further. And again, because you're going to have a binding there, you don't really need to backstitch there. There are different methods that you would probably learn as you got more into quilting bigger items. For how far off you go or how far you stitch. But with this type of quilting, see on the top here, I'm about 3 stitches away from the edge, but I do know that that will be covered by the binding. As long as all of the stitching is secured. So I might start a little bit further back this time. So I'll show you this other side of the seam, and then I'll go ahead and do that quilting on both of these pieces to get to the binding. Now right here, at times you will have fabric bunch up, and even if all your squares are perfect. So it's not only a matter of pushing everything through the machine, it's sometimes a matter of holding it straight, like this. I've got 2 hands here and I'm holding it like this. And one thing it's good to do is trim all your threads right at the fabric, at the edge of the fabric. It just saves time later on because you have to trim them off anyway. So there is stitching on either side of the seam in one direction. And I will do that for each of the seams in both directions. I have finished machine quilting both placemats going in both directions, and I leave the pins in until both directions are done. So I'm not sure if you can tell that that is quilted. You can see the pattern on the back. Maybe that's a better way to look at it. So now the next step is to remove the pins, trim the batting, and then the binding, and get ready to attach the binding. I've trimmed the batting very close to the edge of the top fabric on one of the placemats. They're both quilted. I have left the pins in the four corners because those are the only areas not stitched down. But as you can see here, even though I thought I had this placed correctly, I'm only left with about 1/4 of an inch there, and not much more on this side. So turning that over twice is going to be 1/8 of an inch, and that means that I will be doing the same around the rest of the placemat because I will keep it all equal. So luckily, I think what I can do here is just trim a little bit off of the whole thing and give myself a little bit more fabric to work with here. And I will trim these sides very narrow, and then, like I said, I will fold the edge over twice. I will press it, but if you're not going to press it, you can do it by hand like that, and then pin it all the way around before you stitch it. So I'm going to end the video there because I think you can understand what I'm talking about, and that is a fold over binding. And what you will end up with if you do this project will be placemats that look like that with a binding like this. This is about what I'm going to end up with on the bottom here. And depending on your fabrics, machine stitching, you just go slow and be careful and go right down. If you have that narrow a fabric, go right down the center. You know you've folded it over twice, and so you know that you will be catching both pieces of that fabric and edge it. And you also want to line it up if you have done quilting around the edges. I don't know if you can see on this one, but I actually have quilting right above the border there. The binding, right above the binding. So that is about the only thing that didn't come out quite the way I wanted to, but I can trim these fabrics off just enough to give myself a way to make a fold over binding for the placemats. I still have to trim this off the side, and it'll be narrow like this one. So it is actually a fast, easy project, and I have no idea why this one shifted because I have more fabric at the top end. But when you run into little things like that, there are still ways that you can get around it and make yourself some quick placemats. Actually, these also make wonderful gifts. If I get a coordinating fabric and make, say, 9-inch square napkins, I would cut 9-inch squares of the one fabric and then do a similar edge, a fold over edge, folding it over twice on all 4 pieces, and give someone 2 placemats and 4 napkins and maybe some napkin rings. It makes a wonderful gift. It's easy to do, and it's also a great way to have your favorite fabrics around your house. I decided to go ahead and tackle this right now because in my case, I'm working with a little bit less fabric than I would like. So I switched to 1-inch pins, very short pins. I turned the fabric under twice, and I now have the 2 long edges pinned that way. And I wanted to explain this, which I had forgotten to say before. I don't do mitered corners on this type of a project. I will stitch each of these long sides, and then I will come back, trim this to where it needs to be, and do the short sides the same way. And when I do that, the fabric will only be about this long. I'll be folding this in and up. So you end up with kind of a mitered corner, but I try to square it off, whichever way it looks neatest at the corner is the way I do it. If I can fold it straight up and have a square corner, I do it that way. If I have to do a mitered type of corner, I fold in a triangle of fabric, and then it goes up and fold it over twice. Now, one thing I didn't mention was the zigzag stitch, because what I may do with these placemats, because I'm more or less, I have to have a narrow border. You could, of course, cut your fabric. I was dealing with one piece cut in half was only giving me so much top to bottom width. If you cut your fabric wider, you won't even run into this, and if you wanted to, you could have a ½ inch border on yours. So, but what I've run into is this narrow border, and one thing I could do is put this right in the machine with a zigzag setting of about 2 or 3 on the Brother LX3014, and come right down and zigzag. I'd actually start this way so that the pin heads are on the right, because I want to be able to pull the pins out easily as I do that. So that's an option too, is just using one of their smaller zigzag stitches and zigzag right down here on each long side, then fold this up, trim it, fold it up, and do the same thing. And that will make a very durable placemat. So there are a few choices to make between hand or machine quilting, hand or machine finishing. I could just slip stitch this in place and be done with it. You know, it's still an easy, fast project, and in almost every project you're going to run into something, whether it's your corners are off by a bit, or your fabric shifts, or in this case I didn't have it as centered as I thought I did. So those are the Patchwork Placemats. I have the zigzag on 2, and the stitch selector is on 2, and I have the tension still at 2.5, and I'm going very close to the inner edge toward the quilted area. I did just hit a pin, so I don't know if my needle is now dull. And I did actually plan on ending this video a minute ago, but sometimes you just dive right in anyway and hope this works. Now when you get to the corner or the end of the long side, you have to make sure that your fabric is folded over as it was earlier. And stop right at the corner so that when you go to turn up the other edge, it doesn't get in your way or there aren't any stitches in your way. I would have liked to be removing the pins more easily when I did that. I really don't like running over pins, especially small pins. But this looks like it will work just fine. I think that's blurry. But I think it's a very narrow zigzag, but I think it'll work just fine. So I think what I will do, I'll go ahead and finish the binding on this placemat. And there they are, my two little patchwork placemats. And they look a little wavy right now, but the backing fabric I used was a little bit thicker than I expected it to be. So once I either wash these or use them or press them, they'll sit more in a flat way. But they're easy to do. They didn't take me very long at all to do. If I had done them in one sitting, it wouldn't be long at all. Maybe 3 or 4 hours total. If I sat down at the beginning, having the squares pre-cut and started the piecing, I think at the most it would be about 4 hours to make 2 of them. Probably closer to 3. But there they are, simple patchwork placemats.